Hi, I'm Mark Dalton, member of Horizon Lodge OTO. My subject tonight is going to be Aleister Crowley and his secret chiefs. I got interested in this topic a while back when I did a presentation on Victorian occultism, which led to another presentation called Ascended Masters Over America. I was tracing kind of the development at that time of Madame Blavatsky's Mahatmas, or her masters, which later developed into Ascended Masters, which finally reached its peak with Elizabeth Clare Prophet, who had a group called the Church Triumphant, which was a big occult organization in the 70s and 80s. And the Ascended Masters kind of turned into a uniquely American group of ascended beings. And I have that presentation on paper if anybody's interested in seeing it, and I'll talk a little bit about that at the end of this presentation. But it brought me back to Crowley and his secret chiefs, which I hadn't learned a lot about. And so I started to research it in more detail. So that's what I'm going to talk about here. Whether they're called bodhisattvas, messengers of light, adepts, mahatmas, masters, or secret chiefs, the idea of extraordinary or perfected beings who seek to assist humans and humanity to move forward towards enlightenment extends back thousands of years. In Mahayana Buddhism, a bodhisattva is an enlightened individual who postpones the attainment of nirvana in order to help other suffering beings along the way, a concept that Crowley would no doubt encounter in his Buddhist studies with Ellen Bennett. According to historian and Crowley biographer Tobias Churton, the ancient Gnostics believed that the sleeping human spirit is stirred by the call of the ultimate divine by way of divine men or messengers of light. Such beings have come forth from the true God throughout our history. Our examination of such enlightened beings begins with the legend of Christian Rosicrucians, promulgated by the mysterious Rosicrucian Brotherhood in the early 17th century. The legend would have it that Rosicrucians, born in 1378, traveled throughout the Middle East, collecting esoteric wisdom from the ancients, which he passed along to a handful of adepts, who each then went to a different country, establishing the nucleus of a mystical brotherhood, which has worked behind the scenes to influence the course of history ever since. There are still various groups of believers calling themselves Rosicrucians, and Rosicrucian concepts have been woven into mainstream Freemasonry as well. An important Freemason who pushed the idea of secret chiefs was a German, Baron von Hundt, born in 1722, who in 1742 met a mysterious stranger who convinced him that surviving members of the Knights Templar had successfully hidden themselves for hundreds of years following the death of de Molay in 1314, and secretly joined lodges of stonemasons in Scotland and went on to create Freemasonry as it was known in the 18th century. Armed with this knowledge, von Hundt became the most prominent member of a rite of Freemasonry known as strict observance, so called because each member had to swear allegiance to unknown superiors, presumably the secret leaders of the Templars that had purportedly contacted von Hundt in Paris. The rite of strict observance did not long survive von Hundt's death in 1776 as an important part of Freemasonry, but the idea of unknown superiors remained embedded in Freemasonry, however unconscious at the times, along with the legend of Jacques de Molay and supposed Templar origins. The idea of a secret organization of enlightened beings intervening in human history was further developed in the late 18th century by the early German Romantic and Christian mystic Karl von Eckartshausen in his book, The Cloud Upon the Sanctuary. Eckartshausen's basic concept was this: from all time, there has been an exterior school based on the inferior one, which is the outer expression. For all time, then, there has been a hidden assembly, a society of the elect, those who sought for and had capacity for light. And this interior society was called the interior sanctuary or church. All that the external church possesses in symbol, ceremony, or rite is the letter expressive outwardly of the spirit of truth residing in the inner sanctuary. It was this idea that the young seeker, Aleister Crowley, was introduced to by Rosicrucian historian and Golden Dawn member A.E. Waite. When Crowley contacted him in 1898 seeking guidance on where to look for answers on his spiritual path, which is interesting because later in his career, Crowley was highly critical of A.E. Waite and made fun of him and poked at him a lot. But it was really A.E. Waite who got Crowley initially involved in this kind of organized occult activity. Taking Eckartshausen's idea at face value, according to Churton, Crowley sent out a requisite spiritual prayer for sign and guidance, that's quote unquote. If worthy, the secret chiefs would furnish him a sign. Later that summer, in 1898, we find a 23-year-old Crowley in a bar in Zermatt, Switzerland, at the foot of the Matterhorn, having some after-climb drinks and pontificating about alchemy, which Crowley knew a little bit about. This drew the attention of a chemist named Julian Baker, who knew much more about alchemy, and he moved the conversation along. Crowley, thinking that this might be the sign he was hoping for, the next morning he found Baker out hiking and confessed his search for a spiritual brotherhood to him. Baker hinted that he might know of such a group, and when they both had returned to London, he introduced Crowley to another chemist, George Cecil Jones. Jones was a serious student of magic at this time, and he introduced Crowley to some of the basic elements of the art. They would become good friends over the next decade, and Jones quickly became impressed with Crowley's intelligence and his commitment. After some discussion with Baker, the two men decided to introduce and sponsor Crowley for membership in their magical society, the Hermetic Order of the Golden Dawn, described by Churton as derived, allegedly, from a mysterious German source by Freemasons enthusiastic about Rosicrucianism. On November 18, 1898, Crowley was initiated into the Golden Dawn, ever after noting this date as the beginning of his life's purpose. He adopted the motto, Perdurabo, I will endure to the end. Crowley wanted a connection with a higher intelligence. He'd found his secret chiefs. The Golden Dawn had two primary founders, William Westcott and Samuel Mathers. Westcott was trained as a physician and he worked as a coroner, but occultism was the driving force of his life. He was active in Freemasonry and was for a time the head of the English Rosicrucian Society, which is where he met Mathers. And he was also active in the Theosophical Society, Madame Blavatsky's organization. Mathers, too, was a Freemason since 1877, a Rosicrucian, and he was a lecturer at the Theosophical Society. Mathers had a remarkable facility with languages and spent months in the British Library, immersed in ancient manuscripts, including reading the Book of Abramelin, which would later become very important to Crowley, and the Keys of Solomon also. Based on a document called the Cipher Manuscript, which was allegedly found in a Paris bookstall, Westcott established a relationship with a German Rosicrucian master named Annas Sprengel, who was head of a secret society called Die Goldene Dämmerung, or Golden Dawn, in Germany. Based on this supposed communion with Madame Sprengel, whose existence later came into question, Westcott and Mathers brought the Golden Dawn to English soil. Mathers took on the work of writing the initiatory rituals for this society, fleshing out the skeletons suggested by the cipher manuscript into 5 outer order grades: neophyte, zealator, practicus, theoricus, and philosophus. Passage through these grades, as authorized by the resident secret chiefs of the order, that would be Westcott and Mathers, reflecting the will of those hidden secret chiefs, the latest iteration of the unknown superiors, would lead the aspirant to the second order, the Ruby, Rose, and Golden Cross, where they could learn to master practical magic, divination, and astral travel, among others. Beyond that was the third order, which in the Golden Dawn was the realm of the secret chiefs and not attainable by ordinary mortals. These grades, Magister Templi, Magus, and Ipsissimus, were never bestowed in the Golden Dawn. It was left to Aleister Crowley to devise his own methods for opening access to these 3 final grades and ascension to the level of secret chiefs for himself and perhaps others to follow. Mathers moved to Paris in 1892, a move which left his control over England's Golden Dawn at risk, and subsequent squabbles would prove to be Mathers and the Order's undoing as the century wound to a close. But in the meantime, Crowley rose rapidly through the ranks, mastering the outer order grades with ease. Seeing Mathers' loss of control of the order as an indication of the secret chief's displeasure, Crowley eventually decided he was now anointed to carry on the work by establishing a new magical order. Crowley established one of life's great friendships during this time with fellow Golden Dawn member and magician and later Buddhist monk Alan Bennett. With Bennett, Crowley would study yoga and find it to be an essential discipline to add to a magician's toolbox. He also began his connection with the Abramelin ritual, using Mathers' translation in his initial efforts to gain knowledge and conversation of his guardian angel in 1899. So here we are at this point. The young Crowley has encountered the secret chiefs, first through Eckartshausen, and then Mathers, and then the Golden Dawn, and he has offered prayers to them for guidance and received signs. He is immersed in ceremonial magic and is becoming a believer in its efficacy. He is traveling, climbing, taking in as much life as he can grasp, coming up as an inexplicable encounter which would eventually change the course of his life forever. In April 1904, Crowley was with his new wife, Rose, in Egypt, immersed in the magic of the place, spending time in the Great Pyramids, the museums, roaming the ancient city of Cairo. Rose became insistent that something important was going to happen. At Rose's direction, 3 days in a row, at noon precisely, Crowley went into a room where an entity called Aiwass dictated 3 chapters of what was to become the Book of the Law. The Book of the Law has generated controversy across its entire existence, and the controversy began with Crowley himself, who simply did not at first know what to make of it. Churton notes that at the time, Crowley was ambivalent about this occurrence. He had discussed the occurrence of previous trances with pioneering psychiatrist Henry Maudsley shortly before the event, and Maudsley's opinion was that such things occur because of overstimulation of the brain. Indeed, according to Wikipedia, Maudsley was agnostic, and as such was critical of religion and reports of ostensibly supernatural phenomena. In his book, Natural Causes and Supernatural Seemings, from 1886, he wrote that so-called supernatural experiences were disorders of the mind and simply malobservations and misinterpretations of nature. Both Crowley and Rose were admittedly under the spell of Egypt at the time, and if you've been there, you know what this means. But Crowley was repelled by the 3rd chapter, as many have been since. From the Confessions, he said, "I was bitterly opposed to the principles of the book on almost every point of morality. The 3rd chapter seemed to me to be gratuitously atrocious." Crowley initially sometimes leaned toward a psychological interpretation of its origins. His comment in 1907 was that the book was a highly interesting example of automatic writing. But later that same year, he also said, "I'm in no way responsible for any of these documents." By 1920, he was still chewing this over. He wrote, "Who wrote these words? Of course I wrote them, ink on paper in the material sense, but they're not my words. Unless Aiwass is to be taken as no more than my subconscious self, or to be a part of it." But later that same year, 1920, he said he was now inclined to believe that Aiwass was mine own guardian angel, and thus he is an ipsimesis, the head of AA. Just as Crowley wrestled with the meaning of the book, he wrestled with the nature of Aiwass for many years. By the end of his life, Crowley was settled in his mind on this matter. On April 10, 1946, he wrote to Karl Germer, "The Holy Guardian Angel, and by extension, Aiwass, is an individual just as you and I are. He lives in 4 dimensions, just as we do in 3. Don't confuse the higher self as such. These things are mainly just parts of one's own being. Don't confuse it with the higher self." The work assigned to Crowley by the secret chiefs was the elevation of humanity. He believed that attaining superconsciousness of the highest order is attainable by known methods. According to sociologist Ian Drummond, Crowley was developing a system of known methods whereby students following in his wake could, through natural ability and sheer dint of aspiration, discipline, and spiritual courage, attain the summits of the Great White Brotherhood. Through elucidating the third order grades of the AA, Crowley was able to combine his own views of progress through illumination with his own role as prophet of the new eon. For an excellent summation of Crowley's relationship with the secret chiefs, I refer you to his final work, Magic Without Tears, section 50. It's entitled AC and the Masters, Why They Chose Him, and section 51, How to Recognize Masters, Angels, and How They Work. It was my German Lutheran grandmother's 90th birthday. She was asked about her religious beliefs. She looked over the gathering of her children, grandchildren, and great-grandchildren and said simply, "I love God and I fear him." Churton, in his Beast in Berlin, says, "All things told, however, Crowley paid a price for his eventual liberation from Christian fundamentalism." Crowley, as a child, had obtained and absorbed a vivid sense of religious authority. However much he rebelled against it, it remained deeply embedded in his basic makeup. The sense of higher beings prescribing his behavior, or else, continued to guide his actions. The angry, jealous God of the Old Testament driven Plymouth Brethren and his lay preacher father, whom Crowley loved dearly until he died, when Crowley was barely adolescent, bore a certain resemblance to the secret chiefs who later demanded that he follow their dictate, or else. It was interesting to me to learn that the Plymouth Brethren attracted their members primarily from England's educated upper class, and that Crowley was reading and studying the Bible daily by age 4, as was the custom in Brethren household. In the United States, these kind of religious fundamental organizations seem to appeal most to working class people as opposed to educated upper class people, but the Plymouth Brethren weren't like that. His father's death when Crowley was 11 left him at the mercy of his mother and an uncle, his mother's brother, whose bourgeois mediocrity and sometimes violent attempts to enforce their will upon Crowley led to a rebellion which took various forms throughout his life, certainly against fundamentalist Christianity. According to Churton, Crowley's time with Mathers in the Golden Dawn gave him something of a father figure. He admired Mather's intelligence and his attitude of compelling authority, even as other Golden Dawn members resented it. Mather's secret chiefs, who governed not only the Golden Dawn, but guided human destiny in other ways as well, resonated with an overriding sense of divine authority that Crowley had received from his father and his religious brethren early upbringing. Churton sums up this thought by writing, in simple and even simplistic psychological terms, Crowley lost his father, but he gained new ones eventually. But what I really like is the way Churton sums up his love for his subject, spread over many volumes. At this point, Churton has been writing and writing and writing book after book about Crowley and his various places he lives and what he was up to, sometimes almost on a day-to-day basis. Real interesting stuff. Crowley sums up his love for his subject like this. Crowley could sleep rough and live rough, though he was a natural in the company of good things, good conversation, lively women who saw life as a poem, happy and playful always amid the grandeur of inimitable nature and inimitable art. That's what I know about the secret chiefs so far. Thank you for your patience.
Thank you.
Any questions?
I don't know if you mentioned it or not, but do you have any thought where Eckartshausen got the idea for secret chiefs?
My theory is that it was part of that stream from Rosicrucianism into Freemasonry. Von Hunt kind of trying to shoehorn that idea. This guy he met in Paris was, Von Hunt thought, Prince Charles, Bonnie Prince Charlie, in disguise in Paris. And he took Von Hunt aside and said, here's who I really am. Here's what was happening with these Templars that have lived on for 400 years and really invented the Scottish rite of Freemasonry. And he bought that story. And he was a pretty persuasive guy too. So for a while in Germany, this branch of Freemasonry that he enthusiastically endorsed and promulgated was kind of a big deal for a while. But after Von Hunt died, it sort of just fizzled out.
So yeah, so your essential idea then is like that the Freemasonry myth that they tell during their initiations, like they present that as fact. Like during their initiations, they're like, yeah, the builders of the first temple, they left and they came to England, I guess. And, but that they were still people at that time. And then like eventually, it's like they sort of transitioned to, especially in Crowley's case, being like not people anymore.
Yes, they transcended their humanity. Madame Blavatsky's Mahatmas were still human beings, but they had really transcended or enlarged themselves. They actually, she saw them as like living mainly in Tibet, or that area around Tibet. But because they were so advanced, they could teleport themselves anywhere in the world, and they would meet. It reminded me of the Roman gods that would interact with people. You might meet an actual god on the highway and, just run into him, that sort of thing. Blavatsky had that idea about her Mahatmas and had met some of them, and they came and talked to her from time to time and kept her going on the right path, she would say.
Do you remember where she met them?
Well, she went to Tibet.
And but she didn't meet them. They didn't like appear in wherever she was.
Later on, I think they would, wherever she was, they might show up, talk to her, especially Kuthumi, that one guy, was her main contact with them.
Yeah, Crowley at one point, he did think, at least this is what I've heard and read a little bit about, is that he did think Aiwass was like a guy who like wrote him a letter once.
Yeah, Samuel Aiwass.
Yeah,
he's an actual guy.
But like it's unclear like how long of a period he thought that, and if he how seriously he really took it.
Did it happen? Did he write him a letter before or after the delivery?
No, what happened was that Crowley wanted to know, I think, a spelling of something that added up to 666. And so he received a letter in the mail from someone who figured out like a spelling of it that added up to 666. And he signed the letter Samuel Aiwass, which got Crowley's attention. And so Crowley set up a meeting with him, and he's an actual like flesh and blood. He was a real person. They worked together for a while, and somebody did a Noticon presentation a few years ago on who this guy was. He was like exists in the census and in places. He was an actual person. What's very interesting, one of the things that you touched on was this like a dichotomy in Crowley's thinking about spirituality between, on the one hand, the kind of scientific illuminist approach where it is experimental and empirical and, theoretically, at least anybody can do this if they apply the methods, right?
Right.
And then on the other hand, this idea of like, no, some people are just chosen, right? Because clearly he didn't become the prophet of the new aeon under his own force, right? You don't become, that's not how prophets are made. Prophets are chosen, and he understood himself as, having to fulfill this destiny that was appointed to him. And he even struggles with it and talks about how he didn't want to be a prophet, which is actually very classic for a lot of prophets. Like the prophet Jeremiah didn't want to be a prophet either. So it's an interesting dichotomy in his thought that on the one hand, his public facing base is often like, empirical, scientific, experimental, but privately he's struggling with this whole question of his like identity, really, in the face of like a cosmic mission that he didn't choose and didn't aspire to, and in some sense didn't even want.
Yes. That period of time, I've been reading a lot about that. It was like a remarkable period that science was advancing. Darwin had shaken a lot of people's religious beliefs to the core, and they were trying to figure out, a number of people were trying to figure out some way to make religion dovetail with science, so we could take the advances in science, but continue to have a sense of religion, of connection with some spiritual beliefs that worked in the modern era. I just brought a new book into the library that's, well, it was here. Oh, yes. Strange Rites, New Religions for a Godless World. This is an extremely academic book, but it's got a lot of interesting stuff in it about just people's efforts to kind of stay connected with the concept that there is such a thing as spirituality when you're realizing that we're a tiny speck in a gigantic universe.
Jocelyn Guthrie wrote a really interesting history of those attempts called the Theosophical Enlightenment. And this is one of the things that it's kind of easy to forget now, but like occultism was founded as a secular scientific approach to spiritual questions. Like that's where Catholicism comes from, and the idea of ancient solar worship. And Godwin traces this from the late 18th century up through the Golden Dawn and Rosicrucians. Yeah, it was all like naturalistic attempts to like reduce religious experience either to natural phenomena like sun worship or ultimately to biology. Of course, Darwin gave a lot of impetus to that as well, and
Mhm.
certainly a lot of the stuff, a lot of the mysticism around sexuality and sexual alchemy and magic with sexual fluids and so on and so forth was part of. I mean, today it's like that attempt to sort of be biological reductionist is considered to be kind of like reactionary, but in the early 20th century it was considered like cutting, very cutting edge because it was
Definitely.
they saw it as anti-superstitious and bucking, these old ideas of, a completely unknowable God. It's like, it scientifically,
Mhm.
it's in the phallus.
Yeah.
Yeah, the other one, I don't know, recent secret chief research, one of the Golden Dawn heads, like one of the guys who runs one of the Golden Dawns, I don't know if it was Nick Burrell or who it was, but he was posting online, okay, secret chiefs, I'm gonna be at this cafe at this time, like for every day for a certain number of days or something like that. And if you contact me and you give me the correct signs and words or whatever, I will turn my Golden Dawn order over to you. Because it was sort of like strike me down if I'm not the true chief of the Golden Dawn. Like, no, I don't think anybody showed up, or like one guy showed up and was like kind of just joking around or whatever. But it was so yeah.
Pretty funny.
They have in the most optimistic viewpoint, they have abandoned the Golden Dawn.
Mm.
They no longer care to run the Golden Dawn, or at least one of the largest Golden Dawn orders.
Mhm. Yeah. Crowley was pretty hard on Mathers.
Yeah.
They've deserted you. Oh, it's me now.
Yeah, I'm the top dog. Remember he wrote him a letter and said,
Yeah.
I'm the top dog.
Right. That's how he would
And
say
got a
it.
big curse in return.
Yeah, that's ironic considering the dogs are damned in the Book of the Law.
Yeah, and if reports, I've seen a something from one of Crowley's, at least an acquaintance or a student of his that like claimed to have visited him later on in his life and asked like, "Hey, have you heard from Aiwass recently? Like, how's that going?" And Crowley actually claimed that according to this guy that Aiwass had abandoned him, that he hadn't had any interactions with them in a long time.
Mm.
So at least at some point in his life, he was sort of like, well, yeah, nothing new. I mean, and if something had happened, he definitely would have written it down somewhere or whatever. But
Mhm.